Hey guys, my name's Emily, and today's passage comes from Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. So I'm going to start off by reading this passage, and then I'm going to kind of talk about why this passage is significant to me, why I chose it, and then we're going to break it down verse by verse and just get some historical context and background information on it and just really dive deeper into the passage. So verse 23 starts by saying, "Now when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves, but he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' But he said to them, 'Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?' Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, so that there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, 'Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" So I chose this passage because I had grown up hearing it in church and in Sunday school, and I was really familiar with it. But my perspective on it totally changed this last summer, and God really opened my eyes and kind of showed me a deeper meaning behind this miracle that he performed. And I named the title of this message "Shifting Your Perspective." And I also chose it because I feel like the storm that the disciples were currently experiencing in this passage is often like storms that we're experiencing in our lives. And I found it really significant when the disciples were calling out to Jesus and they're like, "Lord, where are you? Like, why aren't you saving us from the storm?" When Jesus was literally in the boat. And even though he was asleep, he was still in control and he still knew what was happening. Just like in our lives when we call out to God and we're experiencing a storm and we're saying, "God, where are you? Why haven't you ended the storm? Like, where are you? What's your plan in this?" He's still in control, even though we can't see him and knows exactly what's happening. So some background information on this is in verse 23, when it's talking about he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Previously in this passage, Jesus had been teaching great multitudes of crowds. And he was very tired and exhausted from continually doing that, so he needed to rest. And verse 23, and honestly, the whole passage is a great example of the humanity of Christ and saying that after the work that he had done, he was tired and needed to rest. Just like when we are super busy with school, with our job, with anything, homework assignments, tests, that wears us out and we need to rest, just like Jesus did. So verse 24 is talking about when they got in the boat, Jesus fell asleep, and suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, but he was asleep. So then his disciples came to him and awoke him and saying, "Lord, save us, we're perishing," in verse 25. And this verse highlights the fear and the panic and anxiety that the storm that the disciples were experiencing was welling up within their souls and within their surroundings. And they were terrified. And they're like, "Jesus, why aren't you stopping this storm?" And they began to doubt. And they began to say, "Jesus isn't going to stop this storm. He's asleep. Obviously, he's just going to let it happen and we're all going to die." Which is oftentimes I know I have when I felt storms in my life. I'm like, where's God? Like, is he not going to do anything about it? Like, is this it for me? But in verse 26, this is one of my favorite verses in the whole passage and honestly the whole book of Matthew. And it says, he woke up and he said, "Why are you fearful? Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" This part of the verse was very convicting for me. So previously, like I mentioned, this summer, I was experiencing a storm in my life. Anxiety and panic and fear and doubt, and it was just all combined over the summer, and I was anxious all the time. I would have panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and honestly, I didn't really feel like it was going to end. I didn't feel like there was going to be a way out of it. And I opened my Bible one day and I read this verse and it stood out to me. It was highlighted in my Bible. I had highlighted it before. And it says, where Jesus was talking to the disciples, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" And I have never felt so much conviction, but also so much comfort at the same time in a verse. And this has been one of the most shifting perspective verses that I have ever read. And it's so critical to me that he says this, because he's saying, why are you doubting me? Why are you doubting my ability? I literally created you. I know exactly what's going to happen. I know your purpose, and I am with you every step of the way, and I got you. And then in the second part of this verse, it says, then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there's a great calm. So over the summer, I kind of learned the value of surrendering to Christ. And I think this is a beautiful picture of, first of all, when the disciples were experiencing doubt and fear, and then they let Jesus take over, and he calmed the storm, and there was a great calm, and it was flat, and there's no more waves, there's no more winds. And I feel like this is significant because when we finally surrender to Jesus, the winds and the storms, we surrender control, there's freedom, and they stop and they cease. And in verse 27, it says, his disciples marveled and they said, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? So I think, honestly, the most important thing I learned over the summer is how there's so much freedom in surrendering to Christ. And even though we're walking through a storm, there's freedom in knowing that, yes, I'm going through this, and yes, it is hard, but Jesus has already ordained the events of my life. He knows what's going to happen, and he knows the storm that I'm going through, and he knows what's going to happen when I walk out of it, and he knows what's going to happen when I walk into another storm. So there's a couple of really key points and key takeaways that I found within this passage. And the first one is that Jesus sent his disciples into the boat with him, already knowing that there was going to be a storm. And Jesus, like I was saying before, knows our whole life and knows events that are going to happen, decisions that we're going to make, and storms that we are going to experience because of that. But he already knows, and he already has sent us into that storm. But this meaning that when we are going through the storm and when we walk out of the storm, there's a plan and there's a purpose. A lot of times the tests that we experience are turned into our testimony. And definitely over the summer, the test that I experienced was anxiety and fear. And God brought me through the other side of that storm, and I could only have done that by him and his strength. And the peace that I found when he calmed that storm, there was so much freedom and surrender in that. And I was free of anxiety. I honestly haven't really felt it since that point. I don't have panic attacks anymore, and it's because of the grace of God and because I surrendered to him. But he brought me through that storm knowing that I was going to go through that, and now I can flip that test and turn it into my testimony and share it with people like you guys, and saying, yes, this was a storm in my life. Yes, it was hard, and I questioned where God was, and a lot of times I was saying, why me? Why do I have to go through this? But he had a greater purpose for that storm, and he turned it around, and I have been strengthened through that. But my relationship with Christ is so much better, and I feel so much closer to God because of the trust aspect in this relationship that I get to have with my Creator is strengthened so much from that storm. And this reminds me of John 16:33, where it says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart because I have overcome the world. And I love that because it is a promise from Jesus that we're going to experience storms, but he has already overcome them and he's already brought us through them. So also Deuteronomy 31:8 says, the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you and he will never forsake you. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. So many times for me, my anxiety was rooted in the fact that I couldn't control my situation, just like the disciples. They were out of control in this storm. Like, they couldn't do anything to stop the storm, and a lot of fear and anxiety was rooted in that. But when we surrender control, we find freedom. And just like when they finally surrendered to Jesus and he came up and he said, why are you fearful? And then he calmed the storm and there was a great calm. This is a beautiful reminder for us that when we walk through storms, we're not in control of it, and we can hand over control and surrender to Christ. So those are some big takeaway points, is knowing that God has already ordained storms in our lives for the better, and our test can be turned into our testimony. So thanks for listening, and